Welcome back to the Podcast Digest, folks. My name is Dan Lizette, and I'm very happy you've joined us again this week for another great conversation in our interview series. I can't wait to introduce you to my guest this week, but first, I want to thank you for sharing this show with your friends and family. If you know a podcast fan or someone who is just getting into them, tell them to start their exploration at thepodcastdigest.info. It's a great place to get started on finding the best shows on the web. If they're on Twitter, tell them to follow the show at Pod Digest, or on Facebook, facebook.com/thepodcastdigest. All your feedback is appreciated and can be emailed to the show at thepodcastdigest@gmail.com. And if you like what I've been putting out these last few weeks, especially for these interviews, the best way to let me know is to leave a review on iTunes and Stitcher. I promise, folks, it won't take you more than 90 seconds, and it will mean the world to the show and to help people find it. Now, on to this week. This week's guest is Kyle Gest, creator and host of the Lapse Storytelling Podcast. I featured the Lapse back on November 9th of 2014 on episode 11 of the Podcast Digest. This is one of the first shows that I've lately been recommending to folks to really demonstrate what's possible to be achieved by a solo podcast producer. And if you've listened, you're dying like I am to kind of hear from the man himself on how he pulls all this off. Kyle Gest, welcome to the Podcast Digest.
Hi, how's it going?
Doing great. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us here and help spread the word about the great show that you are putting out. For anybody, for some reason, who hasn't heard about it yet, tell the folks about the Lapse Storytelling Podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Lapse is kind of, it's an audio-rich storytelling podcast. So that means essentially that there's a lot of post-production involved. There's a lot of kind of music and sound effects. And the idea is that you listen to the show and you're supposed to kind of feel like you're there. It's supposed to provide kind of a filmic experience in an audio-only medium.
And what is the history of this show? How did you come up with this idea? Did you have any inspirations? Kind of what was the progression arc of the show to this point?
Yeah, so I mean, my background was in film, so I had a knack kind of already for editing and post-production, but didn't really want to work in film. My father worked in film, and I just in general, 15-hour days, not really my thing. So being kind of fiercely independent, even since I was a kid, I had a mentor in university. He goes by the name of Ryan Knighton. And interesting guy, by the way. He's, if you can imagine, a blind screenwriter. That is exactly what he is. Not something that usually goes together, blindness and film, but he's been doing pretty well for himself. Bit of a juxtaposition as well. Like, he's covered head to toe in tattoos, but he can point them out to you wherever they are and still gets them to this day. But he was a huge influence on me because I didn't listen to podcasts. To be honest, I had no conception really of what a podcast could do or what's been going on in that space. But he was going to be on the live version of This American Life. He's been a guest on that show a couple times, and I had no idea what that was. I didn't know who Ira Glass was. And when I actually sat down and saw the show, I had kind of this revelation that there were stories out there that, I don't know how to put it, something about true storytelling spoke to me because I had lived so many kind of true stories myself, kind of dramatic experiences growing up. And I was looking for an independent medium to pursue, and I figured podcasts were kind of the thing to go to.
And I think the parallel with This American Life, or you finding out that you drew inspiration from that show, is pretty clear to any of us who've listened, and I've listened to the whole catalog at this point. And folks that are a fan of those shows, or you like that type of format, and there's other similar ones, I would say, put you in the same class as Snap Judgment, Criminal, those type of stories, really almost Radio Diaries and The Truth as well from Radiotopia, all sort of fit in the same genre. This is one that needs to be on that list if this is something that you guys are interested in. However, and you've pointed this out many times, these type of shows that we're talking about have huge production staffs, part of large conglomerates, those things. How do you ultimately, because and I know we're going to be talking about this, you are a one-man show. What's your research and production process like to put together, an average episode of The Lapse?
So it usually takes a couple weeks to put together an episode. Because it is mostly a solo process. I have one person who helps me out with the transcription process, but generally speaking, I put my feelers out there for stories. I get a wide variety of emails from people who are both genuine and people who are insane. So that's sort of the risk of putting that out there. But I can generally filter through that stuff. And I have a bit of a back and forth with the storytellers and try and figure out the thread that works best and what it is we kind of want to talk about. Once we sit down, I think it's far more casual of a conversation than people expect. I guess listening to the show, it does sound very produced and very practiced, but many times the people that I actually speak to have either never told a story before or aren't really sure what they want to talk about. So it's more of an interview that I end up cutting later to sound like a kind of coherent story. So that's where the writing process kind of comes in.
Well, in terms of the choices, so you said that you'd get all kinds of different story ideas here. And when you're making the choice, say, what to go after next or what to even include in general, kind of what are you looking for? What might be the most entertaining, most informative, all of these things? Sort of what's the selection process like?
Really comes down to how much I see there. I mean, a lot of times people sum up their life experiences. The difficulty is getting to slow them down because not everyone thinks they have a story. But that is sort of my mantra and has been running the show, is that everyone has a story. It's just a matter of pulling it out of them. So sometimes people will submit just out of curiosity to say like, hey, I've got this thing, but I don't really know what to do with it. I had this thing that happened to me, but maybe you can figure it out. So yeah, then I just have to talk to them and kind of figure out like, okay, you said, for example, I don't know, you had, I'm trying to figure out, should I talk about episodes that have already happened or should I talk about ones that are coming up? In any case, they'll talk about something and it's just a matter of slowing them down for a second rather than glazing over their entire life in the matter of 30 seconds. So, it's like I had cancer, then my cat died, and then, the sky fell. It's you got to slow down those moments and draw them out and kind of figure out story beats. It's really comes down to writing experience. Like it's no different than writing a screenplay. Just viewing somebody's life, there are story beats and there's a flow and there are acts, but it kind of takes somebody else to necessarily see them sometimes, especially if it's your own story, I find. I've had that experience where if it's your own story, it's difficult to see it from that sort of perspective, that it is a story rather than a series of jumbled events.
So you start with somebody who has submitted a story idea to you, and then you interview them. And is that sort of the first step, if you will? So you're collecting audio of the interview. After that piece is complete, where do you transition into next?
So then I need some transcription done. I have to transcribe the interview so that I can actually see what's there. Once I'm able to see what's there, oftentimes I will figure out the story from there. There's been cases where I've sat down with somebody and we both knew that they had lots of things to say, but we didn't know necessarily what the story would be that would come out of it. So sometimes I figure out what that's going to be. If I already know what it is, I move into the writing phase. And so the writing phase essentially takes their interview, cuts out all of my questions, and then I add narration so that their voice flows into mine and back and forth. And it sounds like a coherent story as opposed to a series of jumbled interview questions.
So you're looking for breakpoints in the story, transitional elements where you can kind of introduce and move from, you said, from one act to another potentially. And then the music and the sound effects and those pieces come in. That's something I'm really interested in hearing about because that's one of those ones that really sets the Lapse apart from so many other shows. What's that like?
That is definitely a time-consuming process. That is by far the most time-consuming process of the show. That takes days. Just spotting for sound is the first thing I do. So I just look at everywhere I could add sound effects, parts that I could use to replace, say, dialogue or even things that they said. If there's a particular sound element that's important in the story, I don't need to mention it by word. Sound is supposed to paint the picture and tell the story in itself. So there's a large process of collecting sound effects. I've got gigabytes and gigabytes. I've just been scouring the web for free sound effects, or recording them myself. Getting an odd collection of who knows, everything from cornflakes to whatever, right? It's a Foley studio likes to collect junk, so I've been doing that. And then the process of finding music that is either affordable or royalty free, and putting all of that together. Yeah, it's by far the longest chunk of time of the show, but it is probably also the process I think I enjoy the most. There's a certain satisfaction in, like, it's kind of like solving a puzzle, I guess. That is the way I see it. It's just sort of piecing things together, literally, because there are clips of people's voices and clips of audio. And there's something, it's very jigsaw-like, I guess you could say.
Well, as I mentioned, it definitely stands apart as a differentiator, for sure. You can really hear, when you listen to some of those shows we've been talking about in the same class, if you will, when yours comes up in that playlist and you work through the story, you can definitely tell a differentiation on your use of the sound and on your use of that sort of interpolated narration, if you will, and it comes out to a wonderful effect.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Let me ask you this. Let me ask you this before I get into the next question. The time, if you had to say on average, and I imagine that there is a range here, but how many hours are we talking in production in an episode?
Goodness. Here's the thing: is I've been told I should measure this. I never have. Oh gosh. I mean, for the post-production process, and that's simply putting together the sound effects, and the music, and cutting together the audio. That's a minimum of 24 hours, I would say.
Wow.
By itself. The other stuff, the talking to people, the back and forths, the writing, that varies, I guess.
Right.
Depends on the person and how much they need, and how nervous they were in front of a microphone. A lot of them are, and that requires a lot more cleanup and a lot more. The interview can tend to go on a little bit longer. So,
but it's probably a safe assumption. It sounds 30 to 40 hours per episode is reasonable.
Yeah.
That's amazing. And the only reason I've asked is that subject has actually come up in some of my previous conversations with podcast hosts, and it's been very telling to me as each type of host describes their show and their process, sort of this ever lengthening, timeline into episodes. And one of the things, and this is becoming a theme in each of my recent episodes, but I think that's okay. I talk a lot about feedback, that listeners, if you really enjoy what you're hearing, how great it is for a podcast host to hear that there's somebody out there on the other end enjoying what they're doing. Even more so when you're putting in the time and hours and efforts that come into one of your episodes.
Yeah, it's a huge motivator. I mean, without that sort of stuff, it's sort of like, screaming into the darkness, right? Like you want to hear feedback. You want to hear that what you're making is important to somebody in some way. And yeah, that is definitely the reason I keep the show going. When I hear that stuff, be it through Twitter or through iTunes or through the Patreon campaign that I've been running, like all of that is encouraging and tells me that the show is not just something that people like, but something that they will continue to like and that I should continue to do.
And I want to talk more about the listeners and what that engagement has been like. But before I do, I did want to ask you, before we fully leave this long production process and this huge involvement and these interviews with these folks that I imagine you've met from far and wide, different backgrounds and experiences. Some of these stories have been, really mind-blowing. You must have had a story or two of some crazy experience or something that you haven't shared yet. What is maybe something that was especially funny or something you just remember fondly during all these 30, 40 plus hours in producing something like this?
I have had some interesting experiences generally I filter out the stranger kind of people I don't quite believe. I'm pretty good at just not responding to those or sort of pushing them by the wayside. But I did have somebody that initially my website was kind of much more casually written, and it was something along the lines of there was a line on there that said something along the lines of if you want to go for a beer, like Kyle's the kind of person who would say yes. So somebody actually found me, lives in Vancouver locally, and she sent me an email suggesting that she had she would be able to help with the show in some way or something to that effect. And she said, "Do you want to go for a beer?" So I said yes, and why not? Because at the very least, I would get a story out of it. And sure enough, so I went to meet her, and as things are going on, the more I'm asking, like, so what would you like to do for the show? Like, how would you like to help? Turns out she says that she hasn't really listened to it. And she's very confusing. So we continue to go through that, and she starts to make hints. And the more hints she's making, the more I realize that I think we're accidentally on a date. Because I already have a girlfriend at this point, I should add. So she's saying things like, so do you live with roommates, or is there going to be anyone home tonight? And I'm like, I'm sorry, I have a girlfriend. I don't know. And she got so, she's like, I'm so sorry. Is this going to be awkward, or what do we do here? And so, yeah, we chatted it out, and we said our goodbyes, and I said we'd be friends, but I haven't heard from her since. I'm not sure if she was a fan. I have no idea how she would find my site and claim never to have listened to the show and ask me to go for a beer. I don't know how that worked out, but
so now here's the most important question: is that line still on the site today?
No, I've removed it since it's no longer there. That is actually when I decided to update the site and make it a little more, at the very least, a little more professional, I guess you could say. Yeah, a little less casual.
Interesting. That's great. Well, who knows that their podcast website would have turned into a pseudo dating service for someone.
Yeah, not what I was expecting. Nor my girlfriend. She still makes fun of me to this day. For the time you went on a date without me.
Yeah. I don't know if I was her, I'd just come up to you all the time. So, you going to get a beer? I would just be using that line constantly. I bet you're going to get a beer, aren't you? That type of thing.
Totally.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about maybe some more satisfying engagement with listeners and feedback you receive. We talked a bit about it before. Generally speaking, what has the reception to the Lapse been like?
Amazing. I had no expectation starting it. I just I was figuring out as I went along. I had no idea how to do podcasts or run websites or any of that stuff. So, yeah, it's been nothing but overwhelmingly positive. I have only heard good things. And I've been very fortunate. I mean, when I first launched the show, it managed to get onto the front page of iTunes, which was not just there's a new and noteworthy section for a lot of podcasts, but this was generally just if you clicked the very front page of iTunes podcasts, it was featured there, like the giant logo. That was within the first kind of few weeks, and that gave it kind of this momentum push where a bunch of people started listening. And that's when all this flood of listenership that wasn't just people I knew, wasn't just friends and family, saying how much they loved the show. And that's when I think I knew that I had something. I had grasped onto at least something that was worthwhile that people were enjoying. So,
and speaking of iTunes, your show was named one of the best of 2014, right?
Yeah, another genuine. I'm always surprised. I'm one of those, I think, my own worst critics kind of people. So whenever somebody, especially iTunes, kind of picks that stuff and I go on to their best of 2014 thing, it's like there's Serial and there's my show right beside each other. Blows my mind.
And how many screenshots did you take of that?
There's a folder. I've got a folder.
I can imagine. I would have done the same. What is the process for things like that? Does somebody call you? Do you get an email, or do you just happen to notice it yourself?
They emailed me. They said that your show's been selected for the best of 2014. Congratulations. They give you like a media kit. They give you things to do, things they would recommend to keep that media push going. Yeah, it's incredible. The only thing I don't have is a physical award. I've still to this day I've never won a trophy, so I'm still I was
waiting
not
for that.
Yeah, I was not much of a sports kid growing up, as maybe you could imagine that. But I'm still waiting for my very first trophy. We'll see if that ever happens.
Well, this probably seems really obvious. I mean, obviously, this would have been something that you were really, really proud of when you found this out. But I just kind of want to hear more about. This has got to make those hours and hours and hours and weeks and weeks and weeks and all this work you put in to feel somewhat worth it, right?
Yeah. I mean, for a corporation like as large and a service as large as iTunes, like iTunes is the thing that people go to. There are tens of thousands of new podcasts every year that show up on that service. So to be the best of 10 new ones is mind-blowing, especially as just an independent producer. Like, it was just me doing this thing. And I mean, you've got Sarah Koenig on Serial and whatnot, but they've got the power of This American Life behind them. You know, there is the majority of those other shows have something else pushing them. They have built-in audiences at some point. And having that was definitely a big one. I was in a lull for a bit there, I think, towards the Christmas period, trying to figure out how to grow the show and what to do. But that's certainly helped.
And the Lapse debuted, I'm scrolling back on your website, it was February 12th, the launch day? Or somewhere in there, early February?
I think it was actually on my birthday is when I launched. So it might have shown up a few other places at a different time, but it was February 9th.
Gotcha. Yeah. Gotcha. So you're not even a year in yet, and you have accomplished something that definitely, like you said, in essence, and under your first year, to be mentioned in the same class category list as a show like Serial or This American Life or these others, that's got to feel good.
Yeah, that's the understatement, I think, of the year. But yeah, it feels good for sure.
Well, let's talk about how you're going to be able to keep producing this. You mentioned it once, and I want to talk a little bit about your Patreon effort. I'm a supporter, albeit at a small amount, but I am on the list, and I'm only supporting 2 podcasts right now: Tom Merritt's Daily Tech News Show and you. That is the only 2 that I've actually signed up for at this point. So, I mean, I think Tom Merritt's another good class to be in terms of podcasters. Let me ask you, how did you make the decision to pursue it? And maybe before then, tell everyone what Patreon is, what it does for those who might not be familiar.
Yeah, so Patreon is it's kind of like Kickstarter, but it's also very different from Kickstarter. So it is a crowdfunding platform, but what Patreon does differently than Kickstarter is then rather than give a lump sum donation to keep the show running and having a specific goal that they have to reach, it's a little more open-ended. So you set your own goals, and you have specific rewards at each tier. But the big thing is that Patreon is a monthly contribution. So much smaller amounts, and this I learned kind of as I went. It's a numbers game. So what you want are people donating between, maybe $1, maybe $5, $10, but they are monthly contributions to keep the show running and to essentially bring in a monthly income as opposed to a yearly crowdfunding campaign. And as a reward for those, at different tiers, there are monthly things that I put out. So, for example, I've started putting out mini-sodes, which are either cutting room floor moments or little side stories that people had to tell that couldn't make full episodes. So I've been putting those out. I've been putting the uncut raw interviews. I've been putting out some of my short films from film school as incentives for people to sign up. And yeah, that is ultimately, I think, what a lot of podcasts are beginning to pursue. Patreon's sort of new, so I think a lot of people aren't quite sure about it. People who've never donated to something, they might have tried Kickstarter, they might have done things there, but Patreon's seen a lot of growth. From my understanding, they've grown something like 1,000% over the last year in terms of donations. So it's coming along, and they have a dedicated section for podcasts, unlike Kickstarter. And yeah, I'm using it in order to hopefully make a sustainable living eventually out of this thing.
Well, let me ask you to talk about this one, because I really want to hear your voice on this, because you are somebody on a Kickstarter who has, or sorry, you got me saying it now, on a Patreon exactly. On a Patreon site to get that crowdfunding. On a successful show, you have, as we talked about, one of the best shows out there, in my opinion. That's why I recommended it. But so from your perspective, here's what I've heard from some people listening to podcasts when they hear about something like Patreon is, I already get this for free. Why should I donate? So I have my own opinions on that, but I would love for you to talk to any listener who might be thinking it that way.
Why should you donate? Well, are we specifically pitching my show or Patreon in general? I guess is the question.
Maybe a little bit of both.
Well, in general, I think crowdfunding is responsible for some of the best independent art we've seen in years. There are projects that we've never, ever seen the light of day. Kickstarter was the beginning of that, but Patreon allows artists to produce content and kind of make a living out of it. And the fact is, the Lapse is something that takes, like I said, about 2 weeks to produce. So it is almost a full-time job. I mean, I put together an episode that takes about 2 weeks, but I also have to manage the stuff that's coming in and then promoting the show and all that stuff takes additional time. So, it's one of those things where not only does, $1 might not sound like much, but it adds up. In fact, if you look at some of the other podcasts, some of the much larger podcasts, they're actually making $10,000 a month through Patreon. So it's possible. It's just the small numbers and adding those up. And the money is one thing. I mean, admittedly, like, sure, if you've got $1, it's not going to make or break my bank. But what it does do, and this is by far the most important part, is it encourages me to keep making the show. It tells me that even if you've only got $1 to spare a month, you liked the show enough that you were willing to put that $1 my way. And that is really the bottom line. It's kind of like if you can imagine someone busking on the corner at a subway, at a transit station, and their guitar case is constantly empty. They're probably not going to want to keep playing. You know what I mean? It's a tip thing, I guess.
That would be the way I would look at it. That's one way of looking at it, and I think it's a very valid way, is sort of that tip thing, sort of that tangible recognition of one's efforts and their enjoyment that they would receive from that person's efforts. But I think it actually goes a little bit beyond that, and I think one of the things that, and I mentioned, and one of the reasons I really wanted to highlight sort of what your process is that your show and its participation in Patreon, to me, is a wholly legitimate aspect to it. And the reason I mention that is a lot of the shows I've recommended in the past, and I would put myself in that category, they're very simple. I'm down in my basement, I got a microphone, I talk once a week to you great folks listening, and that sort of is it. And there's a lot of podcasts out there, I know, because I listen to a few, and I have stumbled across hundreds more where it literally sounds like two guys in a garage BSing for a week. And that's fine. Some of those are great shows, but when you take a look at a show like Kyle's and what he's doing and what he's putting together, the two guys in the garage aren't preparing for weeks or for 30, 40 plus hours to put on that conversation for you, whereas Kyle is with the Lapse. And I think that's one of the distinctions and why I think it's a legitimate position in terms of your participation on Patreon and why I support it. And
I appreciate it big time.
And I think it is something that needs to be more publicized, because every once in a while I hear shows that have people call in or whatever the case may be, and somebody will be anti-Patreon or not, or question why it should be there, and it starts to boil my blood sometimes.
Yeah, the notion that, I don't know, something should be free forever. Like I never would ever want to charge people for my show, but I did have sort of an angry response at one point of the notion that I would ask people to crowdfund, the audacity of it, and that hurts a little bit. It's one of those things where it's like, well, you liked the show enough beforehand, you liked it enough to binge listen to the entire thing, but the fact that I would ask for $1 is unacceptable.
Well, and I'll ask people to really think about your monthly spending and how much money do you waste? You know, I get it. I'm a big Red Bull drinker. I drink those all the time. And let me tell you what, they're expensive. And, you know, if I could skip one Red Bull one day and throw that at one of my favorite podcasters, I mean, come on. You know, that's the way I look at it. It's like, come on, guys, you know, let's be realistic. Evaluate your own spending over the course of a month. And I bet you could find something $5 or under that you've, quote, wasted, or you ever bought something, tried it and thrown it away because it was no good. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons why I think Patreon is a legitimate avenue for folks assembling a show like your own that really and legitimately could use the support to make sure that something that is so high quality and enjoyed continues.
Well, thank you. I certainly appreciate it.
Well, let's move on and talk about the future. And so you've got the Patreon in place. You've continuing to effort new and the episodes, the additional Patreon bonuses. But 2014, the first year, was so great for you in the show. What do you foresee coming up in 15 and beyond?
Well, I guess that's one of those things. I mean, the podcast, it's hard for me to put into perspective. Like, yeah, a year is not that long for a podcast. Because for me, it feels like, whoa, that was a chunk of time putting that stuff together. But going forward, yeah, the listenership has been growing quite substantially. I had to move from a 2-week release schedule because it was taking me 2 weeks to put together an episode. I moved to 3 weeks so that I could promote the show some more. So the listenership has been growing pretty steadily the past few months. And I was planning to end the first season in February and try and move towards a crowdfunding campaign of some sort. I was considering Kickstarter, but Patreon's, I think more and more people are beginning to see the worth there and attaching to it bit by bit. So if things go well enough, I would like to just continue the show without interruption in the next month. And we're getting close. That first goal was really what would tell me if I get to $200 a month.
Right.
I was like, you know what? I think I'm on good track to continue the show as is and just keep on trucking. And I think I'm just shy of 50 from that goal at the moment. So it's coming along. It's just a matter of getting there.
Well, hopefully folks hearing this will jump on that bandwagon and through our conversation agree to add with it. And let's talk about this a little bit, because you mentioned there was sort of this little dark period or a little lull. And I remember I jumped on your Patreon. I don't know exactly where I was. I think it was the 8th or the 9th. You were stuck at one number for like a good period, what seemed almost maybe a month, and I think I was one of the single digit supporters. And once you sign up on Patreon, you can log into your account, you can check it, and so everything that I support, I always go back and kind of see how are they doing, make sure things are going well, that type of thing. But recently, as you mentioned, it does appear as if a corner's been turned. So between that dark period you mentioned and the Patreon stall but this turn, like, where's your head been at with the show through this process? What of sort of your evaluation of where things stand?
I guess it was a matter of, again, like I was still kind of learning as I went. So social media is something I was not pursuing as much as I should have, and honestly, a lot of the supporters have come out through just something like Twitter. That's how I met you, was through Twitter.
Yep.
And as I started pushing that, I guess people started to realize that I was actually a person, not an entity. And I think that makes all the difference. So beginning to talk to people on Twitter. In fact, I've had several people say, wait a second, I had no idea that it was just you doing this thing. When they talk to at the Lapse Podcast on Twitter, they assume there's an organization behind that. There's not. It's just me. So that I think has by far been the most successful means of pushing the show.
Let me ask you this question, because if anybody has been listening to this show, your show, The Lapse, as I have, or gone through the back catalog, there's a question that's eating in the back of their brains, and I'm going to go ahead and ask it. Just curious what your response would be. we mentioned the sort of class or other type of shows that we would consider you in the same class of. Has there been any thought or conversation about sort of aligning with a bigger network like a Radiotopia or have you had any thoughts to that type of process?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that would be the natural step as far as growing the show. Radiotopia, up until just recently, did not have an official submissions process.
Right.
They were sort of out searching for things themselves. So that is something I think I intend to do, is approach them. If there are other platforms out there, I'm all ears. I know I have had other kind of smaller podcasters approach me for the idea of creating our own, but I feel like it's one of those things where if you're gonna do it, you got to go big, and I think you have to stick with kind of well-established podcasts or podcasts that have kind of a built-in fan base. If you're going to be moving to a network, I think if you're a bunch of tiny podcasts creating a network, that might make a small bump, but I don't think that's ultimately. Essentially, I had a friend of mine who did a similar kind of thing, but what happens with a lot of young podcasts is they either fall by the wayside or they give up for whatever reason, and so younger podcast networks that get together also have a habit of dying, and rebranding is not something I want to do. It's something I want to avoid as much as possible. So yeah, I am looking into kind of some of those networks, but nothing as of yet.
Well, I think it would be great if that were to ultimately happen, because I think that would allow you the structure or the support structure that a lot of the concerns that have been sort of weighing you down as an individual, even just that technical resource and the time sink would really be helped by having a network behind you, so to speak. And I mentioned Radiotopia, one, because I'm a huge fan, two, because I've also reviewed several of their shows, but And I can tell you that if anyone from Radiotopia is listening to this, and I doubt that they would be, but hypothetically, go take a look at Kyle Gest's show, The Lapse, because I have a feeling that it won't take but an episode or two before you realize that this needs to be a part of your family. And I think that's where it should fit. Well, I will challenge, listener, if you like storytelling, if you listen to Criminal, or you listen to Snap Judgment, or you listen to This American Life, Radio Diaries, The Truth, any of these shows, one or more of those, subscribe to The Lapse, throw it in the mix, take an episode, stick it right in between those shows, and just hit play. And you tell me if it doesn't fit. I bet you will think that it will.
Well, that's a very large compliment. I appreciate it.
Well, I'm looking forward to seeing more of what you're coming out with, Kyle. I think the work that you're doing is it's yeoman's work in terms of the effort, and but I can tell you as a listener, I really think that the final product is great. But I want you to take as much time as you want right now. Tell folks about the Patreon, the website, Twitter. How can they find more about you and The Lapse?
Certainly. Well, so I'm on Twitter at The Lapse Podcast. If you want to talk to me, that's a really good place to do it. I get back to people as much as I possibly can, because I really like engaging with my listeners. But there's also my website, thelapse.org, is where you'll find links to whatever it is you need to. The Patreon campaign is at patreon.com/thelapse. That is where you want to go if you do feel like supporting the show. There are, as I said, a number of rewards kind of there that I've been sticking in, trying to give people a little more incentive. Everything from minisodes to the grand one. The big one is at the $10 level. We're going to be doing some Google Hangouts, and I'll be sharing some of my own personal stories. And I will send you a postcard handwritten by me as a thank you. So there's a bunch of stuff on there, and I would appreciate you checking it out.
And I'll make sure all those are linked up in the show notes as well. So, folks, if you're on your phone or tablet, click on the show notes. You'll see all of those links right there on your app as well. Well, Kyle, thank you very much for taking the time. Kyle Gest as the Lapse Storytelling Podcast. Take a listen to his show, folks. I really hope that you will, and I know that you'll enjoy it. So thank you very much for your time, Kyle.
Thank you, Dan.
All right, folks, that'll do it for this week's installment of the Podcast Digest. I hope to have you join me again next week, where we'll be talking to another host of another great podcast. Let me know if you enjoyed. You can shoot me an email, thepodcastdigest@gmail.com. You can find me on Twitter @PodDigest or Facebook Podcast Digest. Just search for that. You will find it. And this is Dan Lizette, and we'll talk to you next time on the Podcast Digest.